Well, welcome to the latest episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Fuz Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined via Zoom by Dr. David Block, an astronomer and a person who heads up RTB Africa. And today we're going to be talking about cave art and specifically what cave art tells us about who we are as human beings and how we relate to God. So you don't want to miss it. Yeah, well, David, this is not your first time on Star Cells of God. You've been on a few times before, but you are formally trained as an astronomer, and you spent a number of years as an astronomy professor. So tell us a little bit about more about who you are, and again, you mentioned, or I meant, we both mentioned that you're involved with RTD Africa. So a little bit about that too, if you don't mind.
Certainly. First, I was born Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, and in fact, this is a very special podcast because this is the 50th year anniversary of me coming to faith in the Jewish Messiah. I came to faith in the Jewish Messiah in the year 1976. So 2026 is indeed the 50th anniversary. uh, I have been a professor of astronomy and applied maths, dealing also in matters of cosmology for a grand number of years. I think I must have served our university here in Johannesburg for close on 40 years. I've been a visiting astronomer, for those who don't know, at Caltech, at Harvard, at the Australian National University, and numerous other institutes, including the University of Hawaii, which has hosts some of the world's largest telescopes. My passion is cosmic dust. God said to me many years ago, I will give you the treasures of darkness, which he did. Our research, as you know, folks, was published twice on the cover of Nature. So we are exceedingly grateful to the Lord for all he has done. And now that I've left the university, formally in South Africa, we have to retire at age 65. I am now heading up Reasons to Believe Africa with my beloved wife Liz, and it's just such a joy. Our association with Reasons to Believe goes back to the 1980s, I guess, or the early 1990s with Hugh and Kathy Ross. And it's just so exciting to see the various doors God has opened as a result of the ministry of Reasons to Believe Africa. I think more than any other time, we are born for a time, Fuzz, such as this.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you, David. And people who are watching this show might wonder, okay, what is a biochemist and an astronomer doing talking about cave art and rock art? What on earth do you guys have to bring to the table? And so let me pose that question to you. Why should our viewers pay attention to anything that you say or I say about rock art and cave art?
This is an exceedingly interesting question because it's certainly not in my professional lane of training whatsoever. But for a grand number of years, I can't even recall how many years, probably 20 years or more, I've been absolutely fascinated by what is called the Bushman rock art. To me, it's a different world. I just love the world of art and the world of science. And to me, in exploring the mindset, this is the key. I want to be able to explore the mindset of the people, of the artists, the Bushman artists, now called the sand artists, the Bushman artists who actually went to these extremely remote sites in caves in southern Africa. And of course, we have rock art around the world, but certainly in southern Africa, it is just so rich with this. And the whole concept, I think it was also born out of Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, where he speaks of the cave man and cave art. And I just wanted to know more and more and more about this. And I was just so thrilled that a couple of years ago, I think Joe and four, I was invited to participate in an international conference on rock art. So it's really just a great hobby of mine, as is photography. But I think what I find so amazing is, and we'll delve into this later, the lineage of our sand, beloved sand folk, and secondly, their rock art. What was in their mindsets when they, I mean, this is long before, I mean, you know, this is eons before the photographic era. Eons. I mean, we're going back just thousands and thousands and more years back in time. And to me, not the primitive mind, the sophisticated mind of the Bushman or the Sand, depicting the most incredible cosmologies, I think struck a very deep chord with my interest in cosmology because the rock art represents their universe. Is that not true?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great explanation, David, and I think my point would be very similar as well. Is that I even though I'm trained as a scientist, I do have a deep appreciation for Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. I love going to Shakespearean performances. Uh, to me, one of my lifelong dreams came true when I was able to see the Hamlet performed at the Globe, at least the reconstructed Globe, in London, and was even, you know, what, what do you call those people that stand that don't even get seats, right? Well, it was there's a name for them. I'm drawing it.
Overflows with, but there's a name.
Yeah, but that's where the poor people that couldn't afford a ticket for the seats got to observe the play. But it was fun because you were much more intimately connected to the actors. But and I love music, though I have no musical ability, and I love art. And I'm always very interested, in particular, in what is the musician, what is the artist, trying to do here as they're expressing themselves artistically, because I think it connects deeply to the whole idea of who are we as human beings, and really our human nature and our human identity is probably more clearly seen through art and music. But a number of years ago, easily 25, 30 years ago, I became aware of cave art and was beginning to think it through in terms of, well, what does this mean with regard to the biblical view of human origins and human nature? And then I began to just appreciate the art for the sake of the art itself. And as this art is incredibly sophisticated. It's unbelievably, there's a profound nature to it that just begs the question, what were these artists thinking, and what was the world that they were depicting? Because it's not just taking images from nature and then recording them in art. There's something deeper going on with this artwork that to me is utterly fascinating. But what's even more important, I think, is that I would argue it deeply connects to the whole idea of human exceptionalism and really lends support to the biblical view of human origins.
Yes, I love that. The, you referred me once to that famous book called The Gap. I can't recall the author exactly, but you would know. And it's that gap. I mean, that's the point. I think that's what we're both trying to say here, Fuzz, is that there's a gap. There's the chimpanzee doesn't go out and paint. Uh, there's a gap. We are self-aware human beings. I mean, whenever I listen to Bach, it resonates so deeply with my soul, and that's the point. Is it not? Is we have souls, and the cavemen. Uh, I mean, sorry, the sand in the caves. They have the beloved Sam have the most incredible artwork, and we need to try and find a bridge from their cosmology to our cosmology because they were very sophisticated. I mean, again, this is tens of thousands of years before photography and just we'll go into this later, but just to be able to reproduce the cave art, which is in extremely remote places. People might not realize this, but in Southern Africa, for example, they're in caves, often very high up, inaccessible. to most people, high up in mountains, and yet they wanted to leave us something from tens of thousands of years ago. They wanted to leave mankind something to show us that in their own right, and I really sincerely believe this first, they were just as sophisticated as artists of today.
Yeah. Well, I've spent a little bit of time learning about the techniques that these artists were using, and and even after I gave a talk one time about how remarkable cave art is in terms of its sophistication, somebody who was an artist who was well versed in cave art came up to me and said, "You don't even appreciate the depth of the sophistication." And he added to what I had learned, uh, this art is incredibly sophisticated. I'm more familiar with the cave art in Europe than the cave art in Africa. But it to me, when I see the images, it looks like it's qualitatively the same type of art. But I mean, these artists were using manganese oxide and ochre and charcoal, which basically gives you black and brown and red and maybe a little bit of orange and yellow as the pigmentation. But they were the perspective, the shadowing. Somebody was telling me this artist that I was talking about said they would actually etch lines on top of the paintings to create a three-dimensional effect. And there was a study done arguing that the cave art also represented a kind of a multi-sensory experience where in the caves they would paint like herds of bison, for example, in areas that if you started clapping your hands would create an echo effect that made it sound like a thundering herd, or where predators were depicted, or portions of the cave that were extremely quiet, right? To kind of emphasize that this is a creature that is quiet, that stalks, right? Or and as you're saying, the place that this art is located in these caves is really inaccessible. It's not like you're walking in and here's a beautiful place at the opening of the cave. These people worked to get into these chambers, which suggests that there was something special or maybe even sacred about those locations.
You know, Faz, not everyone realizes this, but it's not like, giving Rembrandt a canvas and asking him to paint. I mean, these caves, I mean, I've been to the Drakensberg. These are highly inaccessible caves, often, involving extremes, mountaineering, ropes at times. I mean, it is incredible for a modern man today even to try and access them. And it's not as if they had a canvas, their canvas was rock. And as you've beautifully portrayed, they would have used clay, they would have used oxides, including iron oxide, ferrous oxide, to give the orange colors. But they are extremely detailed and beautifully etched, as you've pointed out, but extremely inaccessible. In fact, many people today, in trying to access these caves, just realize the tenacity of the ancient San or Bushmen in even trying to get there. And you've got to try and climb up there with your pallet, if you like, probably feathers and other materials. Um, Ostrich eggs. I mean, it is extraordinary. We must remember that these were hunter gatherers. They were not people who would go home tonight to to a suburb in Los Angeles or somewhere else. I mean, this is, we're talking of ancient mankind here, really hunter gatherers, and they would climb into these very remote areas. Well, and one of my theories there is that they wanted to preserve their art. They didn't want it to be washed away by the rain and corroded and eroded by the elements. And so they were in highly inaccessible places. And but I loved you bringing in the thunder and the clapping, and there's something there about acoustics, art, beauty, mindset, framework that I think teaches as a lot to teach us about modern mankind. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of this podcast today.
So one of the big questions is what on earth were these artists doing, right, when they were depicting this art? And there's a number of theories that are out there. I'm just curious, what I mean, in any explanation is ultimately going to be speculative because they clearly were us, right? In that they were modern humans, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And so they were biologically and in terms of their cognition, just like us. But as you said, they lived in a very different type of world. And so, what do you think they were doing when they were making this art? That just, I'm asking you to speculate, of course.
Well, that's very, very gracious of you, Faz, because what I am going to say is very personal and highly speculative. But I believe that, first of all, allow me to introduce the audience to George Stowe, Stow. To my mind, and then again, this is very biased, but to my mind, he's absolutely one of the great fathers of rock art in Southern Africa. There's absolutely no question in my mind. His name has been derided over and over again because his interpretation clashes with a very modern interpretation, which we'll get into. But to my mind, when I see, for example, um, ostrich hunting, and I see people disguised as ostriches. It makes such sense to me, first. Here you have hunter gatherers. They've got no means of going to a local store, right, to go and buy food. How do you, I mean, which would be the most ingenious way of hunting wild animals? To dress like them, to dress like them. And over and over and over in the volumes I have of rock art by Helen Tongue and by George Stowe, uh, I see over and over again in the captions, it says men disguised as eland or men disguised as ostrich, men disguised as whatever they happen to be hunting. And so I like to place a fairly literal element of interpretation on this phase is that not all sand rock art, and I'm not speaking as a professor of sand rock art now, but not in my mind, and not all interpretations are merely shamanistic and what you see in dreams and visions and trances. And so I reject that totally. I really do. I really, really do. I have the utmost respect, for George Stowe, who corresponded with Blake and Lloyd and others. Um, you know, he was extremely highly regarded at the time. But there are two basic interpretations first, and they clash. The one is the sort of literal viewpoint which I take, adopt, like, for example, the ostrich hunting and people dressing up, as ostriches. It's very clever. I mean, it's exceedingly, so that the other ostriches won't run away, but believe it's one of their kin coming closer to them, and so they don't run away, and the San or the Bushmen are able to kill them. Then the very recent interpretation, far more recent, is that these are all basically or mainly shamanistic in interpretation, everything seen in trances. And the interesting thing is, I say as a cosmologist who always wants proof, have you ever interviewed one? Have you ever interviewed a sand artist who can tell you what this represents? Well, the answer, of course, is no, because there are none left. And I think it's very dangerous for modern mankind to try and infer using our mindset what was going on in their minds. To me, it makes perfect sense that if they were hungry, they needed to hunt for food, and they did it in a very ingenious way. And that's the methodology that George Stowe would have used. I mean, remember, this is the era where he would have, for those who don't know South Africa very well, for example, he would have had to go by ox wagon or by horseback. we're talking of in the 1800s. He'd have to go to these extremely inaccessible sites. He'd have to climb up with ropes and ladders or whatever. And then there was no photography to use. So he'd have to trace. He'd have to trace or sketch out the rock art. And over, at least in his volumes, it's abundantly clear to me that they were, by and large, I'm not saying there weren't exceptions, but by and large, these were hunter-gatherers depicting a most ingenious way of hunting, and that is to dress up as the animals they were seeking.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting because this is probably where you and I would have a mild disagreement because I actually like the interpretation of David Lewis Williams, who I discovered in our conversation that you actually know him. You
Yes,
and your wife.
and I highly respect him. I really do. He's one of our most esteemed, or the most esteemed professor of rock art at the University of the Witwatersrand. I think of him in the higher, and I hold him in the highest esteem. But I really beg to differ on this point that it's solely shamanistic or very largely so.
Yeah, well, and I like his interpretation. And I'll explain to you why, because it means that the art would have carried with it a religious significance and a understanding of a world that was complex, that it wasn't just a physical realm, but a spiritual realm. And so I see that as being consistent with the idea that these people that were making this art were image bearers, right? And because they were image bearers, they, even though they were now descendants of Adam and Eve and removed from uh, that initial relationship in the garden with walking with the creator, that they still would have carried with them that understanding of a complex world and probably would have even engaged in perhaps worship of nature or even worship of you know demonic spirits in a spirit realm. But uh, yeah, so I like that idea that perhaps these were shamanistic visions that were being depicted. Although I don't know that these two explanations are mutually exclusive, uh, or maybe not to go to that extreme that it was shamanistic, but that there could have been a religious role, for the art. Because again, it was inaccessible. It almost seems like these might be sacred spaces. Um, David Lewis Williams talks about the cave wall being um, kind of the veil between this physical realm and the spirit realm. And so you have all these hand stencils that, he argues may very well be an attempt to try to connect to that spirit realm. You have things like these theranthropes, which are kind of a partial human, partial man depictions indicating a sense of an imaginary world. I think that's why I lean in that direction, but I don't necessarily think that it invalidates the view that you favor. Uh, and this is part of the fun, I think, of working and thinking about rock art is to have these conversations. What on earth were they doing, and could this have religious significance? Something that I meant to mention earlier, but I think this is a good place to bring it up, is the amount of effort that was invested in this art, because at least in the caves of Europe, and I imagine this is true with the rock art and cave art in South Africa, these were not just little tiny drawings. These were massive in scale. And they were oftentimes in locations that were inaccessible or easily not readily accessible, even in the cave chamber, that which in and of itself was inaccessible. And so there was a real investment in producing this art, which is a major distraction from surviving. If you're hunter-gatherers, your best chance of living is being out there hunting and gathering or finding shelter, not spending your time making art. But yet this is what these people were doing. And the investment was enormous from a societal standpoint.
Mm. Oh, Faz, absolutely so. I mean, we keep on using this word over and over again. They are basically inaccessible to most people. I think that what concerned me greatly at the international conference I spoke at Rock Art is how divisive the two interpretations have become. In other words, if you support or speak warmly of, for example, I spoke very, very warmly about George Stowe being the father, really, in a very real sense, of the recording of rock art in South Africa. That's my viewpoint. Whichever interpretation you want to take, he went to these caves, he traced out, these volumes were produced long after his death. And immediately when I reached my office, there was a handwritten note slipped under the door saying, "You're totally wrong. There's not one interpretation which supports your viewpoint." Now, the interesting thing is that Stowe himself had many Bushmen or San around him, several, many, and he asked them, "What is this saying? What is this saying?" So I'm not saying that your interpretation or that of David Williams is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is to sort of uh, bury the name of George Stowe. I mean, I think it's the first time that people on this podcast would have ever heard of the name of George Stowe. I think is a sin. I really do. And I think that stands up. In my mind, I always stand up as a Jew for the underdog. I really do. I stand up for the underdog. And I just feel that there are two interpretations here, but don't let's bury the name of one to the sole benefit of the other. I've seen that in cosmology. There was Alan Sandage, there was Gerard de Vaucouleurs, and the two wouldn't speak to one another because there was a divergent viewpoint. And I'm not saying let's come to a middle ground, but I'm saying let's be civil. Here's a man who spent a large percentage of his time recording paintings which perhaps now don't exist anymore, very inaccessible, eroded by water, and so on and so on and so on. But why is there a need? Why is it such a driving nail to obliterate the name of George Stowe? We must remember, too, Fuzz, that the San experienced almost total obliteration in southern Africa. Um, they were regarded as absolute thieves by the local farmers. Because remember, these are hunter gatherers, they need food. And so they would occasionally steal cattle, sheep, or so on. And they were shot dead. I mean, they were essentially exterminated. There are some left. But essentially, by and large, the San in southern Africa, especially South Africa, very largely exterminated. There's a wonderful book on this called Miscast by Pippa Scottness. And it's a terribly tragic story that they were regarded as, I mean, as the name suggests, Bushmen, sort of a very primitive being, not part of us. And I think that the rock art just goes to totally overturn
Yeah, and again, I would just emphasize, we both kind of lean in different directions in terms of how we would view the right interpretation. But I don't, again, don't think that they are necessarily mutually exclusive. And, I think to to your point, to negate one interpretation at the expense of another really is, I think, misguided, particularly when you're engaged in such speculative activity as to try to make sense of what is this meaning. And you have to, you know, I think your point is a strong point. Let's interview some of the artists or people that are, descendants of the artists. They likely culturally are going to understand what this art is telling them. But but even if at the end of the day, the view that I lean towards is falls out of favor, I still think that we both would agree that the fact that there is artistic expression to begin with is really a marker or indication of the image of God. That no other creature, is capable of engaging in art. In the book you mentioned earlier, The Gap by Thomas Sudendorf, he talks about what is it that separates modern humans from other creatures like the chimpanzees, which in an evolutionary sense is our closest, evolutionary relative. Well, it's got to be something. We would say it's the image of God, but scientifically, he argues, well, it's our capacity to represent the world with symbols, and it's our capacity to, combine and recombine those symbols in such ways that we are now able to tell stories or to communicate narratives, which is really not only the basis of, you know, uh, recounting to somebody what actually happened, but it's the basis for fiction. It's the basis for even science to be able to produce narratives. But and so this is really reflecting our capacity for language, which is a manifestation of symbolism. But language doesn't doesn't preserve in the archaeological record, but art does. And if art is also a representation of symbolism, many people would argue that, well, art now becomes this proxy for essentially language capabilities, or it's an indication of symbolic capabilities and an open-ended generative capacity. And I mean, towards that end, there's cave art that was discovered a few years ago in Southeast Asia that people argue is actually telling a story. So they even argue that the cave art seems to be communicating a narrative about a hunt that was going on, that there's embedded in it almost storytelling, which is, I think, the point that you were making earlier with George Stowe's interpretation.
I love the emphasis you keep on placing first on the word narrative. They're stories, whatever the interpretation is. They are remarkable scenes. They are remarkable stories, um, not only of endurance, but I believe, I just wish that there were some alive today whom we could ask what is actually being depicted here. Now, George Stowe did ask, and he was given a sort of a literal interpretation. These are guys dressed up as ostriches and so on and so on. But being created in the image of God is exactly it. And I think that what many people might not realize, Fuzz, but when the DNA code was uncracked and decoded rather by the group of Francis Collins et al., they found that, and from a genetic point of view, and I'd love you to elaborate on this, the San really are bearers of some of the most ancient lineages of mankind. I mean, we're really dealing here with the secrets of the beginnings of Imago Dei. Would you not agree, Fitz?
I would absolutely agree, and I'm glad you brought up the point about the sound genomes, because the view is that you have this trunk for modern humans, and that one of the first branches off of that trunk would be the sand, right? And so uh, they are clearly modern humans, but they were the first group to kind of branch off and kind of form their own cohesive group, right? And the time frame for when this happened seems to be in the neighborhood of earlier than about 130,000 years ago. And there's some very interesting work done by a Japanese paleolinguist at MIT, Miyagawa, and he argues that that the rock art and the cave art produced by the sand is against, essentially identical in a number of different ways to the art that we see in Europe, the art that we see in Southeast Asia, which dates in Europe about 40,000 years ago. In Southeast Asia, there's a report that the oldest art is about 67,000 years, which means that when humans left Africa and began to migrate around the world, they would have already carried that artistic capacity with them. And his argument is, look, if the sand is making art and that the language they use has many of the similarities to languages that we see all over the world, you'd have to argue that that language capacity existed uh, before the sand diverged from the modern human lineage, and that the art must have appeared before that. So he actually places the origin of language and art at about 130,000 years or even older, which is about the time, interestingly enough, where you see that distinct suite of properties that distinguishes modern humans anatomically from other hominins and really sets us apart. So, very interesting, very crude. For an astronomer, this isn't high precision stuff that you're used to, but for somebody that is a life scientist who's looking at how do you probe, historically early events in human history, this is a remarkable broad convergence of the unique modern human anatomy showing up at the same time as language and art.
If I see behind you stars, and I think this is the key point I wish to make, which you beautifully elucidated to, is that when we analyze bills of starlight, um, we break it up we use a spectroscope, and we can say, there's iron, there's sulfur, there's nitrogen. It's done with absolute precision. And we can tell you today, with the eyes of James Webb and others, this star or this galaxy contains this percentage of iron, this percentage of oxygen, this percentage of sodium, and so on. So there's very little interpretation involved because this is really, atomic physics at its best. Now, when it comes to the SAN narratives, we don't have anybody we can interview to check out which of the two interpretations or how they actually fold together or unfold together. But also, I think very importantly, uh, there's a tremendous amount of speculation when all you are left with, Fuzz, are footprints in the sand. I often wonder, for example, when I go to be with the Lord and people come to my desk, who was David Block? Well, it's speculation. You've got to open my computer. You've got to see what images, what books I wrote, and so forth. But it's very difficult from fingerprints or footprints to actually say what was not on the feet, but what was in the mind of the observer. And that's the key point I want to make now is the observer. In astronomy, it all comes down to the observer. The incredibly finely tuned conditions of our cosmos, the Cauchy data, the expanding universe, the Big Bang universe, and so on. And then, eons of time, some 13, 14 billion years later, mankind emerges because the Earth and the Milky Way emerges. But the key point is the observer. And I think that this is what I'd like to really take my hat off to and salute the Bushmen, is that they were incredible observers. Whether they were only observing nature or whether they were also going into the spirit realm is up to interpretation. But they were very remarkably astute observers who would not go by ox wagon or horses because they didn't own those to these remote sites. It was by foot. And I mean, there's no shower in the evening to go and clean yourself. I mean, it's extraordinary how the race of the sand has actually survived so that we can actually still see their rock art. I think it's incredible. But the key point I want to make is that to me is a very key sign of Imago Gay. I can look at the stars behind you, I'm observing them. I can look at Bushman rock art, I'm observing them. And doesn't it come back to, Fuzz, the wonder of the human mind?
Yeah, yeah, that's extremely well stated, David. And um, yeah, because part of, I think, the mystery of being a human, that I think is a manifestation of the image of God, is the fact that the world that we live in is actually intelligible to us. And that really requires two things. One is a creator who designed the world to be accessible, but two, to be, creatures that God would have made that have the wherewithal or that capacity to make sense of the world. It's one thing for the world to be intelligible, but the way the world is intelligible to a chimpanzee is very different the way the world is intelligible to us, right? So there has to be something beyond just simply uh, understanding, maybe rudimentary cause and effect or have associative learning. There's something that goes far beyond that. And I think, the idea that we are made in God's image is a deep, deep, deep explanation for the fact that the sand and other, ancient artists that produce the art in Europe and in Asia were keen observers of the world. There is an interesting paper, and I don't have the citation in front of me. You just brought the paper to mind when you made your comment about the sand being keen observers. Is there was a study done looking at the horses that were depicted in cave art and looking at the position of the legs as they were being depicted running. So they were looking at the gait, and the 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 researchers pointed out that the the positioning of the legs is exactly correct in terms of the way horses run. But then they looked at a number of modern depictions of horses where the horses are running and the positioning of the legs was wrong, right? This is not how horses run. So that these early cave artists had a, a very detailed understanding of the world, even in terms of depicting the relative positions of a horse's legs when they were running, where artists are just completely oblivious to that. So it's remarkable, isn't it?
It really is. And it also brings forth another point which I would love to discuss with you first. And that is this: we live in a world now, going forward from sand rock art to AI. And I mean, if you had to look at images, think of somebody 200 years down the line looking at images you and I obviously have access to. Let's say, but this is just, what mindset was this? And we would say, oh, but this is generated by AI. It's not true. It's not the correct interpretation of reality. Uh, to me, we are going back with the sand to the most ancient stories. You know, the sand had their musical instruments to the early tribes, if you want, of Southern Africa, like the kalimba and other musical instruments. I remember my mother, my late beloved mother, Phyllis. She was a music teacher, and she was very friendly with the late professor, I think it was Hugh Tracy, and he would expound on the wonders of the musical instruments used by very, very ancient tribes. And so you've got the juxtaposition there first of art and science and music and poetry. And is there any difference between what I've just said, art, science, music, and poetry, and you going to be in the Shakespeare in the Globe and listening to Shakespeare? I just believe it's different times. I don't know if I'm wrong, but I see very little difference, except you and I have houses to sleep in, and they slept under the starry skies.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when you look at you Brett mentioned just opposing AI with the sand, and uh, the very first humans were hunter gatherers, were had a very primitive technology, but yet look at what's happened in 130, 140,000 years. We've gone from being hunter gatherers to developing AI systems that begin to mimic us, or at least are on the verge of mimicking us, or we have the understanding of the biological realm so much so that we can genetically engineer novel, non-natural life forms. We've put human beings on the moon. We're sending humans back to the moon. This is incredible to think that this is what we've accomplished, and yet it's not a biological difference between us and the sand. We're the, we're the same. All that's changed is the technology, and that explosive evolution of technology is only possible because I think human beings bear God's image. And as a reflection of that, we have that capacity for symbolism. And it's interesting because when you compare humans with Neanderthals, there's a lot of debate as to what Neanderthals' capability was. Did they actually make art? I don't think they did, but there's a debate that's raging. But when you look at the trajectory of the technology that Neanderthals employed over time, they were on Earth longer than we've been on Earth. Their technology was static. It didn't change. That's something fundamentally different between us and Neanderthals. And, by the way, Neanderthals went extinct, right? They weren't able to occupy all these different environments on the planet because of that technological ingenuity that I think flows out of not only the image of God, but the capacity for language and ultimately symbolism.
I love your use of the word symbolism because I would like to suggest, and I feel even more fired up so in talking to you about this, is that the sand rock art needs to be rediscovered, which it has been, but also elevated to a very new status where we are seeing Imago Dei in a very, very new and beautiful light as perceived by some of the most ancient of human civilization, some of the most ancient peoples, rather, sleeping under the stars by night, camping there, lighting their fires in the deserts. I think it's extraordinary, to be thousands and thousands of miles or kilometers from any colonial city. This was long before that. Those were established or invented. But to me, it's just thinking of this first. In astronomy, you've got, all the different stars and the galaxies and so on with their right ascensions and declinations. But then you've also got astrology, right? And they saw stories in the sky. I mean, you've got Aquarius, or you've got the scales, or you've got Libra, and so on and so on and so on. It's all to do with this. Man is in search of meaning. By man, men and women, mankind, man. Viktor Frankl's book, in search of man, in search of meaning. And I wish to assert tonight, and I hope you agree here, that the Bushmen, the San, were very much in their own cosmologies steeped in a very deep sense, as Chesterton says in The Everlasting Man, for a sense of purpose, a raison d'etre for being here. And to them, that was their way of leaving their footprint or fingerprints, rather, for future generations to say, I was here and this is what I saw.
Yeah, that's really insightful, David. I've never really thought about the cave art and the rock art in those terms. I've often, again, have wondered what were they trying to do, but you're right. It probably ultimately connects back to this whole idea of what is my place in the cosmos, right? They were clearly asking that question, and they were offering maybe an explanation for how they saw themselves in the cosmos. But this idea that you're bringing up too about wanting to leave behind that fingerprint that tells people that you were there, that you lived at one point, that uh, you did something of significance, right? That's very much part of human nature, and and that whole idea of identity. But even deeper than that is this idea that somehow God has written eternity in our hearts, and that that we we realize that you know that there's a tragedy to human existence coming to an end, but can we make ourselves immortal to some degree by leaving behind fingerprints? And very clearly, when you're producing art, you're not only trying to create something of beauty that you're sharing with other people, like when you do it, you're trying to create something that becomes permanent, that extends beyond your lifetime, perhaps, that yet can influence future generations. That's unbelievably profound.
It really is. And, I mean, again, if you think of this point too, another point is that if you and I were invited to a hunt in Southern Africa, say in the early 1900s or whatever, we would take our arms, we would take our guns, and we would shoot to kill. But what's a far more ingenious method? Far more ingenious. And think of that. We were talking about technology. Think of ingenuity in the mind of Imago Dei, where they're actually dressing up. This is at least my interpretation, George. Dressing up as ostriches to go and shoot. It's not just, we've got a gun and let's just shoot it, but let's be part of nature. Let's be part of the story. Let's go and live like the ostrich might live, or walk like the ostrich might walk. Let's go and mix amongst them and intermingle with them until they feel comfortable enough just not to run away. And uh, and then, of course, some of these ostriches are then hunted for food. But the point really is, it's that exceptionalism of symbolism, of meaning, of purpose, of wanting to know why we are here, and at the same time sustaining yourself by means of food that you can live to narrate these incredible stories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really powerful. Because my experience is a lot of times Christians just simply don't know what to do with cave art, and they oftentimes see it as deeply intertwined with a materialistic, naturalistic explanation for nature, or that it feeds into the story of human evolution. But where I have a very different perspective on it, as I think you do, is that I think the cave art is really pointing in a very powerful way towards this idea of human exceptionalism, and exactly in the way you would expect humans to be exceptional if we were truly made in God's image.
And exactly the point we've said earlier, to be observers. I mean, you're so right. Rock art might be so foreign and just degraded by many Christians today. What has it got to say to us? But there's exceptionalism there. There's there's the Imago Dei. I see no difference between you and I listening to Shakespeare, as you've just elucidated, or, for example, me going to a Bach concert in Munich and hearing Jesus, joy of man's desiring, the juxtaposition of music, the juxtaposition of art, the wonder of being in the Sistine Chapel as I have, and with the book, as you know, Garden Galileo, being in the Vatican secret archives. To me, it's all part of the search for man and men and women and meaning. And I believe, most sincerely so, that we've got a tremendous number of lessons to learn, beloved ones, from the rock art, not only in Europe, of course, but in this very continent in which I live today.
Yeah, well, uh, just maybe a few final points. This has been a fun conversation. I knew it was going to be a good time when we were chatting about discovered our love for rock art and cave art a few months ago. But um, you know, uh, this whole idea of a search for meaning, and when I think about the interpretation that you don't care for of David Lewis Williams, the whole idea of uh, perhaps these were shamanic ones, right? Is ultimately there was according to David Lewis Williams, a recognition again that there was a spiritual realm, and that these people understood that the spirit realm could influence the physical realm, and so they're trying to control it. But to me, this is a reflection of this deep desire to connect to the transcendent. And I don't think you have to necessarily embrace David Lewis Williams' reading or interpretation of the rock art to recognize, hey, there is a search for meaning and a desire to connect to the transcendence, even when you to take George Stowe's interpretation that you lean towards. But I think the larger point is that as human beings, again, God has written eternity in our hearts, and there's a quest for meaning and purpose, a desire to connect to the transcendent. And it grieves me if indeed David Lewis Williams is right, because here are these people that are desperately searching for meaning, that desire to connect to the transcendent, but their spirituality is a impoverished one where they're seeking to manipulate the spirits rather than to recognize that they could have entered into a relationship as image bearers with the true creator who made them, right? And so I think that's the take home meaning is that, or the take home message is that there is meaning that we can attain as we seek after it. And that meaning is found in the gospel.
You know, Faz, I love that note upon which you're going to be concluding. And that I'd like to say this. I am sure that this podcast will be watched by David Lewis Williams. And I want to say this. He's a wonderful man. He's a man who's also in search of purpose and meaning. We were both professors at the same university for a gargantuan number of years, astronomical number of years. And I highly respect what he has to say. I really do. It's just that I take a different view. But be that as it may, who is he? He's a man who's trying to understand the mindset of the ancient Bushmen or San and their rock art. And is that not what Stephen Hawking tried to do? Throughout his life, he asked three questions. I remember when he came to South Africa, he asked these three questions, Stephen Hawking did. Who am I? Where do I come from? And where am I going? Who am I? Where do I come from? And where am I going? That's one of the greatest cosmologists. And what I want to say, just as a concluding note, is that I see very little difference between Stephen Hawking's questions and the questions asked by the ancient Sano Bushmen. Who am I? Where do I belong? Where am I going? And where do I come from? In other words, a search for meaning and a search for roots. And maybe there isn't this huge time divide. There is a huge time divide of around 140, 150,000 years when they were so prolific in painting and so forth. But what I'm trying to say is maybe there's not such a schism between the rock art then and how we are trying to express our search for meaning in 2026.
David, let me to maybe bring everything to a close. Let me ask you this question: what would you say to people that are watching this? Where can we ultimately find purpose and meaning?
You know, that's a very personal question. And to me, as a Jew and an Orthodox Jew, the only person, the only fountain of life, the only fountain of life I have ever encountered who can give me the deepest sense of meaning and purpose is in the King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth. He is the absolute, you know, ever since I met him, ever since he chased me, as it were, in 1976, I have the sense of a deep meaning and a deep purpose, knowing that the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And I think at the end of the road with the Lord is not the end of the road, but the beginning of the road. You know, Churchill even said, it seems like the end is nigh, but he said, this is perhaps just the end of the beginning, but there's so much more to unfold. And to me, Viktor Frankl's search, a man in search of meaning. There was a man who once stood on earth, being God in the flesh, who said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And that's why I think that, not why I think, that's why I know that I know that I know that the ultimate search for meaning is to be found in God Himself.
Yeah. Wow, that's just absolutely beautiful, David. You know, it's been a delight to spend some time talking with you about cave art. Hopefully, we have stimulated the viewers and the listeners of this program to think a little bit more deeply about cave art, to recognize again that we, above all, are exceptional as human beings because we're made in God's image and God loves us. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Star Cells in God. We would love for you to take part in the conversation. So leave us your comments in the comments section. Let us know what you're thinking. We love to read the comments that you leave behind. And also, Make sure that you go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, and subscribe, where you can get access to all kinds of great content that engages a wide range of science faith issues. Make sure you use the notification button so you're alerted when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops, which is every Wednesday. And also share this podcast with a friend. And remember that the more we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.